There lived a certain man in Russia long ago, big, strong, with flaming eyes that struck terror into most people. But those same eyes that terrified peasants made aristocratic women swoon. What kind of man never bathes, sleeps with hundreds of women, and still gets invited to dinner with the Russian emperor? Meet Grigory Rasputin, a peasant so disgusting that nobles complained about his smell from across the room, yet so magnetic that aristocratic women lined up to be blessed by him. This isn't your typical rags to riches story. This is about a man who weaponized his own filth, turned religious hysteria into political power, and literally brought down the most powerful dynasty in the world. By the time you're done learning about Rasputin's twisted rise, you'll understand how one unwashed peasant managed to control an empire and predict its destruction with chilling accuracy. The year was 1903, and Russia was about to meet the most dangerous holy man in history. The man who refused to wash. Imagine walking into a room and immediately knowing someone hasn't bathed in months. That was Rasputin's signature entrance. But here's the twisted part. He did it on purpose. Rasputin believed that cleanliness was a sin. According to his warped interpretation of Christianity, washing your body meant you were trying to purify what God had made dirty for a reason. The dirtier you were, the holier you became. His followers called it holy filth, and Rasputin wore it like a badge of honor. Witnesses described his smell as a mixture of goat, rotten fish, and something they couldn't quite identify but wished they could forget. His hair was greasy, matted, and crawling with lice. His fingernails were black crescents of accumulated grime. His clothes? The same peasant robe worn for months without washing, stained with food, wine, and God knows what else. But here's where it gets really bizarre. This wasn't just religious fanaticism. It was psychological warfare. Rasputin understood that disgust creates a powerful reaction. When someone is so repulsive that you can't look away, they've already captured your attention. And attention, as any con artist knows, is the first step to control. The Russian aristocracy had never encountered anything like him. They were used to perfumed, powdered courtiers who spent hours on their appearance. Suddenly, this walking embodiment of filth appears in their pristine salons, and their carefully constructed world of etiquette collapses. Some were horrified, some were fascinated, but nobody ignored him. Women, especially, found themselves drawn to this contradiction. Here was a man who represented everything their refined society rejected, yet he radiated a raw, animalistic confidence that their polished husbands lacked. His refusal to conform to their standards wasn't weakness, it was the ultimate power move. Rasputin had weaponized his own disgust factor, and it was working better than any cologne ever could. The seduction technique. So how exactly does a man who smells like a barnyard seduce sophisticated aristocratic women? Rasputin had cracked a code that modern pickup artists still don't understand. First, those eyes. Multiple witnesses described them as hypnotic, piercing, almost supernatural. But it wasn't just their intensity, it was how he used them. Rasputin would stare directly into a woman's soul, never breaking eye contact, as if he could see her deepest secrets. In a society where men barely looked at women they weren't married to, this intense focus was intoxicating. Then came his voice. Deep, melodious, with a peasant accent that somehow made everything sound more authentic. He would speak in religious metaphors, mixing sexuality with spirituality in ways that made sin sound sacred. To truly know God, he would whisper, you must first abandon earthly shame. But here's his master stroke. He positioned himself as a holy man who could absolve any sin. These aristocratic women lived in a world of rigid moral codes, desperate for someone to tell them it was okay to want things they weren't supposed to want. Rasputin became their spiritual permission slip for forbidden desires. His technique was pure psychological manipulation wrapped in religious mysticism. He would tell women that conventional morality was for ordinary people, but they were chosen souls who needed to transcend such limitations. Sleeping with him wasn't adultery, it was a religious experience, a pathway to divine understanding. The man literally convinced women that having sex with him was a form of prayer. You don't learn this in history classes out there. And it worked because he believed it himself. Rasputin wasn't just a con artist, he was a true believer in his own twisted theology. That genuine conviction combined with his otherworldly charisma made him irresistible to women starving for authentic experience in an artificial world. Within months of arriving in St. Petersburg, this unwashed peasant had a waiting list of noble ladies seeking his spiritual guidance. The scandal was enormous, but the addiction was stronger. The Tsarina's obsession. Of all the women Rasputin seduced, none was more important than Alexandra Fyodorovna, the Tsarina of Russia. But this wasn't about sex. This was about something far more powerful, a mother's desperation. Alexei, the heir to the Russian throne, had hemophilia. One small cut could kill him. One bruise could cause internal bleeding that lasted for weeks. The royal doctors were useless. They had no cure, no treatment, just helpless shrugs as the future emperor writhed in agony. Then Rasputin appeared, claiming he could heal the boy through prayer and divine intervention. And here's the terrifying part. It actually seemed to work. Every time Alexei had a bleeding episode, Rasputin would appear, place his hands on the child, mutter some prayers, and miraculously the bleeding would stop. The fever would break. The boy would recover. Was it hypnosis? Luck? Genuine divine intervention? Nobody knew, but the results were undeniable. Alexandra became completely dependent on this stinking peasant. She believed God had sent Rasputin specifically to save her son. When critics complained about the scandal he was causing, she would fly into rages, defending him as if her life depended on it. Because in her mind, her son's life literally did depend on it. Rasputin exploited this dependency ruthlessly. He would disappear for days, sometimes weeks, leaving the Tsarina in panic. Then he would return, claiming he had been praying in the wilderness for Alexei's health. Each absence made Alexandra more grateful, more protective, more willing to grant him whatever he wanted. The man who started as a village nobody now had unlimited access to the Russian imperial family. He dined at their private table. He played with their children. He gave political advice to the Tsar himself. Court officials watched in horror as this filthy peasant essentially moved into the Winter Palace. But Alexandra didn't care about the gossip, the scandals, or the damage to the royal reputation. She had found someone who could keep her son alive, and she would defend him against the entire Russian Empire if necessary. That blind loyalty would soon give Rasputin the power to influence decisions that affected millions of lives. The fate of Russia was now in the hands of a man who measured his holiness by how long he could go without a bath. Orgies. In the name of God. Before Rasputin reached the imperial court, he was already infamous for creating one of the most twisted religious movements in Russian history. Meet the Klisti, a secret sect that believed the path to God required exhausting yourself through sin. Their logic was beautifully insane. Since Christ died to forgive all sins, the greatest act of faith was to sin as much as possible, then repent with equal intensity. The more you sinned, the more you needed God's forgiveness, which made you holier. It was theological gymnastics that justified absolutely anything. Rasputin took this concept and ran with it. His followers would gather in hidden locations for ceremonies that started with frenzied dancing and chanting, designed to induce religious ecstasy. But as the night progressed, religious ecstasy transformed into something much more carnal. These weren't ordinary orgies. They were spiritual experiences disguised as group sex. Participants believed they were literally becoming one with the divine through physical union with each other. Married women would abandon their husbands for the night, convinced they were serving God by serving Rasputin. The ceremonies followed a twisted ritual. First came confession, where participants shared their darkest secrets and desires. Then came purification through sin, adultery, group sex, acts that would horrify conventional Christians. Finally came collective repentance, with everyone weeping and praying for forgiveness before starting the cycle again. Rasputin positioned himself as the spiritual conductor of these sessions. He claimed that sleeping with him specifically was the highest form of worship, because his peasant body contained divine essence. Women competed for the privilege of being blessed by his touch. Word of these gatherings spread through underground networks. Society women would slip away from elegant dinner parties to join peasants in barns and basements, all seeking this intoxicating mixture of spiritual enlightenment and forbidden pleasure. The authorities tried to shut down these meetings, but Rasputin's followers were fanatically loyal. They saw persecution as proof of their righteousness. After all, hadn't Christ been persecuted too? By the time Rasputin reached St. Petersburg, he had perfected the art of making debauchery feel sacred. The Russian aristocracy had no idea what was about to hit them. Political puppet master. Here's where things get truly insane. A man who could barely read was now influencing decisions that affected World War I. Through his hold over Alexandra, Rasputin became the shadow ruler of the Russian Empire. When Tsar Nicholas II left to command troops at the front in 1915, he made a fatal mistake. He left Alexandra in charge of domestic affairs, and Alexandra did nothing without consulting her holy man. Suddenly, a peasant mystic was essentially running Russia. Rasputin's political advice was catastrophically bad, but he delivered it with absolute confidence. He opposed the war entirely, not from pacifist principles, but because he claimed God had told him Russia would lose. When generals requested reinforcements, Rasputin would declare the battles spiritually unfavorable and recommend retreating instead. But his real power came through appointments. Ministers, generals, even bishops could only keep their positions if they had Rasputin's blessing. He sold government positions like a medieval merchant, taking bribes from anyone willing to pay for his recommendation to the Tsarina. The man literally kept a notebook where he tracked who owed him favors, who had paid him money, and who needed to be eliminated from power. Court officials watched in horror as competent administrators were fired and replaced with Rasputin's drinking buddies and business partners. His interference became so blatant that he would show up at government meetings uninvited, interrupt official discussions, and overrule decisions with claims of divine revelation. Cabinet ministers found themselves arguing policy with a man who thought strategy meant consulting the spirits of dead saints. Meanwhile, Russian soldiers were dying by the thousands, partly because military decisions were being influenced by a mystic who believed battles should be fought based on astrological signs rather than tactical advantage. The German intelligence services couldn't believe their luck. They didn't need to infiltrate the Russian government. It was already being destroyed from within by a madman who thought he was serving God. Some historians argue that Rasputin's political meddling did more damage to Russia than any enemy spy network could have achieved. By 1916, the entire Russian government was held hostage by Alexandra's faith in her unwashed holy man. The empire was collapsing, and the man steering it toward disaster was too drunk on power and vodka to notice the revolution brewing around him. The impossible-to-kill man. By December 1916, even Rasputin's allies had had enough. A group of nobles, led by Prince Felix Yusupov, decided the mad monk had to die. They planned what should have been a simple assassination. Instead, they created one of history's most bizarre murder stories. The plan was elegant. Invite Rasputin to Yusupov's palace for a private party, poison his wine and cakes with enough cyanide to kill a horse, then dispose of the body. What could go wrong? Everything, apparently. Rasputin arrived at midnight, immediately suspicious but too arrogant to leave. Yusupov offered him wine and pastries, all laced with massive doses of cyanide. Rasputin consumed enough poison to kill several men. Then he asked for more cake. The conspirators waited upstairs, expecting to hear a body hit the floor. Instead, they heard Rasputin singing folk songs and demanding more wine. After 2 hours of this, Yusupov went downstairs to find Rasputin not only alive but completely unaffected by the poison. Panicking, Yusupov pulled out a revolver and shot Rasputin in the chest at point-blank range. The mad monk collapsed, apparently dead. The conspirators celebrated briefly, then left to arrange body disposal. When they returned an hour later, Rasputin was gone. They found him crawling across the courtyard, trying to escape despite a massive bullet wound. One of the conspirators shot him 3 more times. This time, he definitely seemed dead. But wait, there's more. As they dragged his body toward the river, Rasputin suddenly opened his eyes and tried to strangle Prince Yusupov with his bare hands. They beat him unconscious with clubs, tied him up, and threw him through a hole in the frozen Neva River. The autopsy revealed the most disturbing detail of all. Rasputin had drowned. Despite the poison, despite multiple gunshot wounds, despite the beating, he was still alive when he hit the water. His lungs were full of river water, and his hands were torn from trying to claw his way out from under the ice. The man who claimed divine protection had proven remarkably difficult to kill. Whether it was incredible luck, superhuman constitution, or something more mysterious, Rasputin's death became as legendary as his life. Even his enemies had to admit, killing the unkillable monk had taken far more effort than anyone expected. The prophecy that came true. Before his death, Rasputin wrote a letter that would prove to be the most chilling prediction in Russian history. In it, he warned that if he was killed by nobles, the entire Romanov dynasty would fall within 2 years, and the royal family would die violent deaths. The letter was dismissed as the desperate ravings of a doomed man. Nobody took seriously the idea that killing one peasant mystic could topple a 300-year-old dynasty. They should have. Within 2 months of Rasputin's death, revolution erupted across Russia. Tsar Nicholas II, the man who had ruled the largest empire on earth, was forced to abdicate. The royal family that had seemed untouchable suddenly found themselves prisoners in their own palace. But Rasputin's prophecy went deeper than political upheaval. He had specifically warned that the Romanovs would die violently, and his prediction proved horrifyingly accurate. In July 1918, just 18 months after his death, the entire royal family was executed in a basement in Ekaterinburg. Nicholas, Alexandra, and all 5 of their children were shot by Bolshevik revolutionaries. The dynasty that had survived wars, rebellions, and centuries of political turmoil was wiped out completely. The last thing Alexandra reportedly said before the execution was Rasputin's name. Some historians argue this was just coincidence, that the revolution would have happened anyway, with or without Rasputin's influence. But others point to his devastating impact on the royal family's reputation. His scandals had made the Romanovs objects of ridicule and hatred among their own people. More disturbing is the timing. Rasputin's death removed the one person who might have convinced Alexandra to flee Russia when the revolution began. He had always claimed he was the family's protector, and without him, they seemed lost, unable to make the decisive choices that might have saved their lives. The mad monk had predicted his own death would trigger a cascade of destruction, and he was right. Whether through supernatural insight or simply understanding the political forces he had helped unleash, Rasputin saw what others missed. that his death would be the beginning of the end. The man who lived by chaos had ensured that chaos would outlive him. In the end, his greatest seduction wasn't of any woman, but of fate itself. Rasputin wasn't just a con artist or a religious fanatic. He was something far more dangerous, a man who understood that in a world obsessed with appearances, authenticity, even twisted authenticity, becomes irresistible. The Russian Empire that had survived Napoleon, countless rebellions, and centuries of political upheaval was brought down by a man who measured his holiness by his smell. That's not just irony, that's a masterclass in how one person's psychological manipulation can trigger civilizational collapse. Today, Rasputin remains a symbol of charismatic corruption, proof that power isn't always seized by the strongest or smartest, but sometimes by those crazy enough to break every rule while claiming divine permission to do so. Want to dive deeper into history's most fascinating manipulators and the empires they destroyed? Hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments which historical figure's dark psychology you want me to expose next.